Welcome to the Chey and Pav podcast experience.
Well, you're listening to the Chey and Pav Show. Teachers talking, teaching. We're two middle school teachers sharing our reflections and insights about the topics that matter the most in the classroom. So hey, join us in the hallway. Let's meet in the parking lot or, even in the staff room.
Welcome to episode 131 of the Chey and Pav Show. Thank you for joining us as we sit around the table to talk teaching. Today, it's just the two of us as we navigate our journey through thinking classrooms within our learning spaces. Join us as we talk about the successes of this math strategy and the areas that we need to tinker maybe a little bit more with. We're excited about the conversation that we're about to have, so let's get into it without wasting any more time. I'm Pav Wander, one of the two hosts of this show. My counterpart is here at the table with me. And if you know anything about him, you know he likes to introduce himself.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's time for a little less conversation, a little more action. That's actually a horrible tagline for a podcast because it's actually less action and more just conversation. That
was a really good Elvis impression. You know that there's a new Elvis movie coming out, right? Was that intentional?
No. The song came up on my gym playlist. I said, I'm using that tonight.
That's perfect. I thought maybe you were up on your pop culture.
Not a chance that I am up on pop culture. And that's why that's the role I play in the Chey and Pav Show, Cheney. I make all the 1970s and 80s references, and you keep us entirely up to date, which is probably why our demographic is much younger than I am.
Actually, it's climbing. I don't know if you've looked at It's aging with us.
Oh, really?
I don't know if you've looked at our statistics lately. Our analytics are showing that the 33 to 44 category and the 44 to 53 category
My wheelhouse.
Neck and neck.
I had no idea of that statistic.
But then here's another interesting fact, is that it skips, as we go down in age, it skips a whole group. And then it's then the next highest blip that we have is 20 to 25 or something like that.
So you're telling me the 25 to 35 think they're too good for us?
Yes. The ones that are in like year 7 to 10 of their teaching journey.
It reminds me of a George Carlin joke about who knows. And he says at a certain age, you think you know, but you don't know. That's what that category of people sounds like to me.
That's right.
But the people think they got it figured out. You don't have it figured out if you're not listening to us.
But then the group that's just before them are the new teachers. So we have a little bit of following, I suppose, with new teachers, which is great. And then the veteran seasoned teachers who just want to listen to us to hear us and say they don't know what they're talking about.
They're just waiting for a sports analogy. The older folks are like, we already know this. We don't need
exactly.
We're just here for the laughs, the good times.
I suppose so.
Pav, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You know, this is a long time since we've just had the mic to ourselves. And last time I was excited to be on the mic, but I also knew it was the Salima interview. So I needed to tone it down just a little bit.
We just had to save the conversation for when it's just the two of us.
That's right.
And today we've got a whole hour to ourselves, another 55 minutes actually.
You mean we're going to 17 minutes? Because we always aim for 17 minutes. Pav, I want to say to the insider baseball, already to a sports analogy, the behind the scenes, we don't put the intro in after the fact. The intro plays and we're just sitting by the mics. And as we got our headphones on and we're muted and the intro music's playing, you're yelling at me for something. And I'm like, what are you talking about? The record button's on. And I realize you're looking over my screen and you're pointing, share that document with me. Share it. And it's related to teaching, but it's not related to the podcast.
I was peeking. I'm peeking at your computer. I was like, what has he got open there? It looks colorful and fun. I need it.
So as I was just about to come up to the thing, I had just finished sharing the document with you. So that is in your Google Drive now. And, in typical Chey fashion, the way I planned my lessons, at the last second, it was done and we were ready to go.
Amazing. Can I tell a quick story? Is this part of banter?
Hold on. Let me check the schedule. Intro, check. Chey intro, check.
Yeah.
Banter.
Yeah.
Which I think you put a lot of pressure on me to facilitate. But if you have a story, I'm going to sit back and listen to your story.
It's just a fun little story. As you were talking about your sports analogies, Chey and I, for those of you who don't know already, Chey and I are back teaching at the same school again. And we're in the same division. We don't teach the same grade. I teach grade 6. Chey teaches grade 8. And this means that we get to be in the same professional learning community together.
This means a little less conversation, a little more action.
That's right. Lots of action when Chey's around, for those of you who don't know. Chey doesn't speak unless he's spoken to, and then he unleashes. But as we were talking, as you were mentioning, increased sports analogies, and those that listen to us just for the sports analogies, Chey introduced a sports analogy to talk about something in our PLC. This is all the grades 6, 7, and 8 teachers that are sitting together and we're talking. And then somebody asks Chey to provide his input. And that's the only time Chey is going to speak. And so then Chey starts and then can't stop, for lack of a better way to say it.
Can't stop, won't stop.
That's right. And then he starts going into a baseball analogy. And as soon as he said batting 500, 5 people walked out of the room. They were like, we're going to have to stop you there, Chey. We've already lost you.
But they didn't stop me.
They didn't. They just threw their hands up and said, I'm already lost. I don't know what you're talking about.
This is all true. There's a little embellishment, but I'll let the listener decide what is embellished in that story. But I will attest to something that I cannot now tell you where I heard this from, but it has resonated with me ever since, that you can display. You want to know if someone knows what they're talking about? If they can put it into an effective analogy, then they absolutely know their content. I don't even know if I saw that. I don't even know where I saw that, period.
Yeah.
But it's stuck with me. And so I've been using more and more analogies to just justify that I do know what I'm talking about because I can put it into an analogy.
Yeah.
Now, it was funny. If you look over my notes, I actually have it marked down right here. That's where I was coming back to this later to discuss the thinking classroom.
This is probably the same point that we were making in the PLC.
Except I didn't make the point in the PLC, but I did make a point, Pat.
Because they stopped you.
No, they don't stop me.
But they did. They said, we don't understand what you're saying. So we had to move on.
That's an embellishment. We did not move on.
Okay.
I redirected. Have you do highlight a lot of things? That as much as I'm really boisterous on the podcast, in the school space, I save my boisterousness when I feel it's needed or wanted, or to make sure that it's not dominating spaces, which is part of the thinking classroom, is decentering the teacher. And on a bigger picture, I can make that comment makes a lot of connections, because in my class, unrelated to thinking classroom, I've been teaching writing and autobiography, and autobiography through music and lyrics. So how do you gift stories to me through lyrics that resonate with you, that remind you of events of your story? And when I model it, I use Gowan, Awake the Giant, as my example, because I use the lyric of awakening the giant to be how I am in the educational space. I can be stoic, which you hate.
Yeah, I hate that term, stoic, as if you say that as if it's a positive thing.
It is.
It's not.
Indeed it is.
It's toxic. I think it's equivalent to toxic masculinity. But we can talk about this another time.
We just made 2 episodes titled right there. So in my stoicism, I'll come back, and if something pushes my button, the giant is awakened. And you'll find out in that moment that I'm more than just a gym guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, and I love it because opposite to the way that we are on the podcast, I won't stop talking in PLCs. I am just there to assert myself. I don't know what it is. It must be that I need to make sure everybody knows that I kind of know what I'm talking about. But I talk a lot. But I also have a lot of experiences to share because I'm teaching math and science this year. So I do a lot of thinking. I have put this really into practice, and it's been one of my goals for the year. So I have a lot to say. So I feel like I just don't stop talking, and I do want to allow others to speak. But Chey never picks up the slack unless somebody directly asks him, Chey, what do you think? And then we awaken the giant.
And he goes off sometimes. Actually, I very seldom go off.
He goes a little less conversation, more action.
I do a little less conversation, a little more action. I get to be very animated when I speak.
Yes.
Which you don't see at all in the podcast. Which is often, you know, I don't remember who we were having a conversation with. Oh, I do know. When we were presenting at the Durham Local for EDFO, we were presenting our podcast, and we were having a wonderful conversation. And I shared that when we podcast on video, it doesn't take me out of my rhythm, but it takes me out of my rhythm because when it's just the mic, I am flamboyant, I'm fidgety, I'm all over the place, my hands are waving. But when the camera's on, I spend a lot of time paying attention to how I'm looking to make sure I'm not distracted, I'm not looking disinterested. It reminds me of a Steve McQueen line from the movies that he always made sure he was acting even when people weren't talking to him, because he felt it was important. In fact, I believe it was, someone in our demographics of 45 to 50 will tell me.
It won't be me.
Steve McQueen used to steal the scenes from actors that had dialogue because he'd be in the background and he would be acting no matter what. Even if there was nothing for him to do, he would do something.
Okay.
And so I don't remember who it was that was infuriated by him stealing the scenes when he was just off to the side.
That's very funny.
And I always think of that when we are recording a podcast.
Yes. But when we are on video for our podcast, it's always in an interview situation. It's always when you have to show that respect to the person who is speaking anyway. So you are a little bit more mindful. I have a feeling that if we were recording just the two of us, like right now, it would be a little bit different. I think we would be a little bit more laid back. I wouldn't care so much about, I mean, yes, I would, make sure that I'm not.
She wouldn't care so much if just a conversation with me.
I would probably forget that no, that's not what I meant.
I know. This is a setup for a gaslight.
Yeah, I know. Now I lost my train of thought. I would forget that the camera is there. Mm-hmm. I would surely forget that the camera is there. And I think that I would like to do that because I think that as a listener, I always envision the people that I am listening to the podcast. If it's the hosts or if there's a guest, I'm always imagining what the room looks like, and whether or not I am correct. That's kind of like listening to an audiobook. You're creating the scene in your mind, which is a wonderful thing for your imagination to be able to do. But it would be kind of fun to see it happening in action. So maybe we'll do that sometime. That'd be kind of fun.
Record live and see us? Yes.
Yeah, then people would be able to see all the faces I make.
Bueller.
Like right now.
Stoicism.
Oh, God.
Okay, the banter section continues. Don't worry, folks that are only here for the thinking classrooms, which is our new teacher demographic. Don't worry, we're getting there. You can skip about 5 minutes if you must.
5 more? We got 5 more minutes of banter?
I'm big time.
Okay, start at 20 minutes for thinking classrooms.
You know what? I only look down at the banters because we have a couple things on the go. I don't necessarily want to get into banter. I want to share a few things. The Canadian Podcast Awards, by now, just about due date on the final voting. And I just wanted to say how humbled and excited we were to be selected in the educational category. Because what do we represent? We represent the independent podcaster that writes, researches, produces, edits, markets their podcast all on their own. And that's not something that's just exclusive to us. Lots of podcasters do that. But we've also done it for a long time.
Yeah.
And to be nominated with a bunch of podcasts that are very much in the same vein, but also podcast from the Toronto Star, podcast from the CBC was really validating for us and really affirming for us. And so we're really excited about that. I know I've probably tweeted it 6 times too many, but there'll be 20 times too many by the time this is all over.
Yeah.
And we are humbled by the nomination, but maybe just a little bit of us is excited for the potential to win.
Yeah. And you know, I always think to myself whenever we put out a tweet, this is what they mean when they're standing on stage and they say it was an honor to even be nominated. When people are accepting awards and they're next to these incredible people, these incredible other nominees, it truly does feel like an honor just to have been nominated. So I think that it's a big win for us. As Chey mentioned, there are some really big names in these categories. And I always felt a little shocked that educational podcasts didn't have like a category of their own when you are selecting, you know, what genre does your podcast fall into? And education podcasts fall into the category of education, yes, but education about anything. So when we're talking about the education field that we are in, the institution of education, that's not a genre of its own. So when we are talking about learning, we're talking about learning in comparison to learning anything that there is out there. So I always feel like, wow, that's a really broad category. And I sometimes feel like teaching podcasts don't quite fit in, like they almost need their own pedagogy genre. And I wish there was something like that. But then this is really cool to be included with the learning of all kinds of things in this world. So pedagogy falls into that category. And so it's an absolute honor, but it also feels like it really decreases our chances for winning. So
maybe, but we will see.
Yeah.
So that's checked off my list. We talked about our Durham local presenting our podcast. And Pav, I'll quickly comment. It was great to finally get into another space to present podcasting because as we drove out to Oshawa, we had the conversation. We actually haven't presented podcasting since we drove out to Oshawa last May.
Yeah, that's right. It's been a while.
Like, not to explain everything through a baseball analogy, but man, when you slumping. And Pete Rose would tell you, don't ever admit to anyone you in a slump.
Yeah.
But it was been a long time. It was so refreshing. And we thank Durham Local for inviting us into their space and having just a big enough crew that it wasn't like crickets.
Yeah.
But it was small enough that we could get everyone in on the mics.
Yeah.
Everyone got a little bit of not just a show and tell, but a really play with the equipment and build some really nice connections. Mm-hmm. And then I guess the big news. Insert drum roll, editor.
I'll put one in.
Yeah, I know.
In the post.
Add in a real one. But you
Okay.
can keep that blurb about how you put in a fake one, but your editing still added in a better one later.
All right.
Please share how we are not presenting.
We are not presenting. You got to put the emphasis on the right syllable.
That was my Captain Kirk
Yes.
impression.
We are not presenting, but I guess by the time this episode comes out, I will have already presented at the ETFO Women's ICT Conference at downtown Toronto. Very excited, but I'm very nervous. So as of right now, while we are recording, I have not yet presented, but by the time the episode is released, I will have already gone through the process of doing the 2 workshops with ETFO for this Women's ICT Conference, which is a real honor to be invited to and to be able to present at. The topic of the presentation is not podcasting this time. It is digital storytelling, culturally relevant photography, and photo editing. I got it. And it is a absolutely amazing workshop where teachers will get to learn about different ways that we can tell stories through digital mediums, and in this case involving photography and photo editing. So it's very exciting, very hands-on. I'm nervous about technology, the technology gods allowing me to do what I intend to do with all of the participants. So I'm praying and hoping that everything works out and that we are able to produce some amazing pieces of art.
As long as you got me on speed dial.
And it's tough because you'll be in the classroom teaching while while I'm there.
Right, I forgot. It's not on the weekend. Don't worry. I just tell my kids, hey, YouTube.
Yeah, YouTube. That's right. Stick them on YouTube and you're on call.
I'm really excited for you doing this presentation.
Thank you.
And just on the bigger scope, I know the idea is digital storytelling through photography, which you and I have done in multiple different spaces for multiple different purposes. But the founding pillar of this is the reframing of Remembrance Day.
Yeah.
And I really think that's really important. Not that I want to dive into, my spiel or rant on what's going on in social media, but I will. And, social media with Remembrance Day just coming up, lots of people with lots of negative comments and lots of gaslighting and lots of innuendos about you not doing this without actually suggesting what they're doing. But I'll talk about that later. But you have been doing this work of the reframing of Remembrance Day through these digital photos for, I think we have jointly been doing 3 or 4 years.
4 years, yeah.
And when I see comments now where now you're highlighted that Remembrance Day needs to change some of the narratives, and this comes to one of my bigger complaints overall on sort of a lot of the social justice work is we spend too much time complaining and not enough time looking out the action. Now I link right back to my elbows. Too little less conversation, a little bit more action. And when the action's there, we miss it. Because this work that you've been doing has been out there for ages. And all of a sudden now we want to take shots that we need to reframe Remembrance Day. It's being done by teachers. It's being done by classroom teachers. And you not looking at it and you not seeing it. It's right there in front of you. It's being gifted to you to how to shift these stories. And we don't know. But yet then we spend all our time on social media pretending that teachers aren't doing this. Wait, we are doing this. And when it is gifted to you, you don't acknowledge it. You don't recognize it. Because you probably don't even want it.
Well,
you just want to be able to complain about it.
Let's hope that we do want it. I think that the biggest issue is the recognition. I don't think that people are very adept at recognizing when it is happening. I think it's that with every area of pedagogy that we want to instill, and I've said this before, I don't think we truly know what we are looking for. I think that we create this checklist in our mind that it has to look a certain way, feel a certain way. It has to include the correct buzzwords in order to fit into that box. I don't think that we are recognizing the work. And I think that it takes a little bit of bigger picture viewing, like a lot of peripheral vision needs to be activated to really be able to see when teachers are doing this work, recognize it, and then acknowledge teachers for doing that work rather than just simply saying it's not happening, because more chances than not, it is happening. It's just not being recognized.
Too many assumptions that teachers aren't doing what people that aren't in classrooms think they're not doing. I think that's a double negative. A little less banter, a little more thinking classroom. When we come back to the Chey and Pav Show.
Get your hands up to the floor.
And you're listening to the Chey and Pav Show. Welcome back, folks. The banter's over. We're into the content, the thinking classrooms. And as Pav talked about, we have been gifted with many opportunities to learn in the thinking classrooms, employ the thinking classrooms as central coaches, and use the thinking classroom model in our classrooms. We make the assumption, again, as I ranted on assumptions, we'll make the assumption that you're somewhat familiar with the thinking classrooms. We won't get into every facet of the thinking classroom. And when Peter Liljedahl gives his presentations, he does break it down. And we'll really talk, Pav, I think about the first section that he breaks down, that idea of the tasks, the groups, the vertical spaces, the centering of the room, and maybe get into a little bit more. If you're unfamiliar with it, just rewind and play that in really slow motion, because I know I speak way too fast. But that thinking classroom model is all about the type of tasks that are being assigned, how we group, how we create, or how we let students engage with the work, like the design, the setup. Then we talk about the setup of the room, sort of our first 4 pillars that, Pav, you and I will talk to mainly, although we might dive into a few other spots. Tasks of work, things that we have seen, and
maybe some issues along the way.
And certainly some baseball analogies.
Of course, baseball analogies. Yeah. So we've, as Chey mentioned, we started learning, and we learned directly from Peter Liljedahl. We were really lucky to be able to receive professional development directly from him when we were centrally assigned teachers, and not live in person, but virtually, but all the same.
One day live. I had Peter one day live.
Yeah. I had him
Live in person.
All of the no, not in person.
Oh, sorry.
you got to see him live in person.
That's right.
Oh, that's right. No, for me it was always virtual, but he was there on the call. It wasn't like a recording or anything.
Yes.
But yes, you got to be in the room with him. That's right. That's really cool. I never got that
He
chance.
gave me stink eye one day when I was paying attention.
Yeah.
I'm only joking. But he did give me stink eye.
Yeah.
But I was paying attention.
He's a very engaging presenter, very engaging. And so we had the opportunity to learn directly from him last year, which is really cool. But the problem was last year that we didn't have our own classroom spaces to be able to put into practice what we were learning. So I was very excited and I was taking a lot of notes and I wanted to try these things in the classrooms. And, I got the white books and tried the vertical spaces in different formats with the classrooms that I was working in, but never really got to put the book into practice the way I wanted to until this year. And so now I am, as I mentioned, I'm teaching math to 2 classes in grade 6 and teaching science to 2 classes as well. So I dove in day one. I got the white book set up around the room, have my thinking stations ready to go, vertical spaces. We'll talk about that in a moment. And really have had that opportunity to put everything into action. And so along the way, I have found some things that have worked really well, and in some cases surprised that they worked so well as they did. And then some things that I am finding that maybe need a little bit of tweaking or need some context, some classroom context based on the personalities that are in the space to make it kind of work. And I think that all in all, it's been a pretty good experience, and there are definitely elements that I'd like to keep going with. And I'm excited to, I also included a little section called Next Steps, like some of the parts of the book that I haven't really been able to implement yet that I'm looking forward to before the end of the school year. So lots to talk about here. Do we want to start with the type of tasks? I know that is the first chapter of the book. So curricular versus non-curricular tasks and sort of what we should be starting with in terms of tasks.
I think that's a good starting point. Beforehand, I'll give a little analysis. I'm really enjoying being able to immerse in the thinking classroom space as a grade 8 language and history teacher. And as the year started, it took me a little bit of time to build the confidence and build enough routines and type of questions to dive into that space. But if you're thinking, where's my first starting point? When I come to have this conversation, I feel really good about using the thinking classroom in my space, in my classroom. I feel really good about using it in language and history. Do I use it for maybe rich tasks? Maybe not as rich as I see you using in math, but as an overall, as a starting point, as a way to, I don't want to get too deep because I'll want to come back to this later, but I think I'll go back. Overall, it's been a really good experience. I also had very good experiences last year as a central coach, and I worked with one grade 6 teacher who I don't want to say let me, she was just as keen to give it a try, and it just made an easy collaboration for us.
Yeah.
I would come in, we would design, now we modified it a bit, and I think, Pav, that's somewhere we want to go to in our conversations. We've learned it's a really rich text and has lots of steps.
Yeah.
And you can default to think you have to adhere to them through thick and thin, no matter what. And I think, Pav, our conversation will show you, and maybe you as a teacher, when you dive into the space, you choose. Now, maybe if Peter's listening, which he won't be, but if he was, he might be like, you don't get to pick and choose. But maybe you trust in the teacher. When I see the 7, the 10, the 12, the groups, what's working, I pick and choose which ones I want to emphasize, which ones I'm a little bit lax with. I sort of go with the flow. I trust my instincts. I trust my observational skills. I trust the student voices in front of me. And I could bring this back to an analogy right now.
Oh.
This is my baseball analogy.
Ooh.
So if I were to check my stats through an entire baseball season as a left-handed hitter hitting left-handed pitching, maybe my stats aren't so good. Maybe I only hit 235 against the 100 left-handed pitchers I face. But in one particular lefty, I own him. And in my 7 at-bats with him, I've got 5 hits, 3 home runs, 2 doubles. And so when that pitcher comes again, the data would suggest my lefty on lefty matchup that I need to be pulled. on the general data, but that specific data on that particular left-hander, I own you. Throw that meatball. I'm going to crush it. And so as I read the room, I hope my coach says, you know what? I know the numbers of the lefty batter and the lefty pitcher don't work out, but I've seen that individual matchup, and I know it goes counter to those numbers. It's a little abnormal, and I see it, and I'm going to go with it. And I go as a teacher, and Pav, this is the comment where everyone put their hands in. What are you talking about? What I'm talking about is seeing what's going on right in front of me. And sometimes, although the general data suggests something, it doesn't always match everything. I'll draw another analogy. It's like airplane.
Hang on. I'm still absorbing the first analogy.
Does that mean it wasn't a good one?
No, it was good. I wanted to match that analogy. And
we're not playing a matching game.
No, I was thinking that when you are like, can you do a statistical analysis when there's that one-off thing that works for you? Can you make that, like, can you argue to your coach the way that we are going to argue to Mr. Liliadol right now that we can pick and choose because the statistics show that on chapter 3 of the book, it doesn't work for us. And there's something very specific that works for us.
Welcome to an episode of PTI where Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon go off on the analytics crew.
Yeah.
And you know, Pep, I don't mean to suggest that data is not accurate.
Right.
It's just that in particular moments with particular dynamics, that data is not going to follow through, as it shouldn't. It's data. It's based on mass amounts of research.
Right.
Of course, there's going to be outliers. And I wouldn't even say it's an outlier. There's going to be moments and spaces where that data isn't so... It's not that the data is not true. The data is just different. It's just generalizations.
What I think what you're trying to say is that it's got to be contextual to the space. We've already established a certain community. We have different teaching styles. We have different personalities. There's different charisma, or the riz, as the kids say. There's different
my kids just
ways.
say, I don't want to do this.
Yeah. There's different ways to engage with students. And if one thing is not quite working for you, then you can try something that does work better for that space.
That's perfect, Pat. I think that's what I wanted to just give the audience a sense of, I like it, I'm using it, and it's going really well. But, not but, and, or whatever qualifier you want to stick in that space, but I'm feeling good enough to just alter what's being suggested to meet the needs of the class, and it's going well.
Right.
And so as a teacher, if you're just getting into it, one, it can be a great foundation to use it word for word, but don't also feel you have to get...
Yes, I 100% agree. And I also, in the case of my classroom, I also haven't implemented all 14 sections all at once. I have been introducing 1 or 2, 3 things at a time. So starting with the vertical spaces, making sure that we're comfortable working standing up, and what that looks like and what that means for students and what that means for teachers. And then using the non-permanent spaces as well, the non-permanent vertical spaces.
I think that's the critical foundation to starting. One is, what tasks are you using?
Right.
Are you using curricular tasks, non-curricular tasks? And we talk a little bit about this. It talks about how you group people off. It talks about the vertical spaces, the whiteboards. You can have the fancy white books, which we've had a great episode on, but it doesn't have to be fancy white books. Any way to have surfaces that are easily...
Dry erase surfaces.
Yes, windows.
Right,
Just don't tell the custodian.
Yeah, as long as it's dry erase markers, you should be fine.
You should have seen the type of paint I got all over the hallway the other day.
Oh, no.
And we were scrubbing hard after school. The design of the room, the layout of the room.
Yeah.
And I think if you're new to the idea, these are sort of your foundational pieces to start with. Layout of the room, the vertical space, how are you going to group, and the types of tasks.
I think that what I will do, there's a great Edutopia article that kind of goes over all of the sections without having to invest in the book right away. And I think we'll link that in the show notes, so that if you haven't dived into the thinking spaces, I know you're giving me a look.
I am.
It's you can kind of get an idea of what we're getting into, what we're talking about before going out and buying the book.
If we were on video, you would have seen my eye roll. I don't certify anything Edutopia until they accept one of my attempts to write a blog for them. I can only be denied so many times.
Oh gosh. I hope that they're not listening.
They're
Or I hope that they are.
They're not listening either.
But yes, okay. So why don't we get into it? So what does it mean, curricular tasks versus non-curricular tasks? So thinking, we don't just think about math, we think about everything. And so one of the big things about the Building Thinking Classrooms pedagogy is that we need to get kids thinking again, like really using their heads to solve problems. And so by introducing the Thinking Classrooms approach using non-curricular tasks, i.e., tasks that don't have to do with any of the math strands that we're doing, then we are allowing kids to get comfortable with that idea of thinking and productive struggle, which we have talked about in the past as well, is just working on a problem until you can get it. Now, get it doesn't mean the same as we've solved it. Get it means I get it to a point where I can come up with some sort of process in order to solve. And so the idea is that we start the Thinking Classrooms approach at the beginning of the year by introducing students to non-curricular tasks so that they are not turned off by math when they are struggling through a puzzle or a problem. Because we can be doing word problems, we can be doing card tricks, we can be doing all kinds of things that are not really necessarily related to math skills, but are problems that need to be solved.
I think that it's almost better to have problems right away where there aren't clear answers, because we really want students, I feel you really want students to get used to not looking at a problem and instantly making it a binary connection. I get it or I don't get it, meaning I see the answer and I don't see the answer, and if I don't see the answer, then I immediately just ask for help.
Right.
I immediately say I can't do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of something that I've been seeing as a teacher, is that how do we make the conditions that allow students to be okay with a question where they don't necessarily see an answer? And I think when you provide a question where there is a definitive answer right away, the chance, if a student sees it, then they don't engage in the thinking. And it's not so much the thinking. For me, it's not so much the thinking right away. It's about being okay or being comfortable with the idea that you may not see an answer right away and not need an immediate bailout to get an answer, which comes back to that centering of the teacher. And I know we've had lots of conversations of, and I move my space around. It's centering it's no matter where you're sitting, even if I'm hanging from the ceiling, as soon as I'm talking, I'm centered.
Right.
I'm centered. So it's a question of we are centered in the culture of the classroom. When the student says, I don't get it, boom, stop, teacher, what's the next clue? What's the next step? What's the formula? What's this? And so I think when you're talking those tasks, Pav, for me, is about sometimes having a riddle or a clue or like a heads up, which we haven't really explained explicitly, but it's a math game I play where there isn't necessarily going to be a right answer or a perfect answer. It provides the space for the normalcy of I'm not going to see an answer right away because it's a math game I play where there's no guarantee there is a right answer.
Right, exactly. So, and I think that's the biggest thing that kids need to understand, that in math and in life and anything that we are doing generally, when we are problem solving, there may not be a clear solution into whatever that thing is. And so providing that, just even telling students, like, there might not be an answer to this, but letting them try and find it anyway. So, with that heads up game, which maybe I'll post a little link to that as well so that teachers can try it. I love it because I tell students that any set of numbers works. I tell them right away, any set of numbers work. And that, it's almost like a false claim, but they work harder trying to find it. And then when they are stuck and just like, Miss, I really, I can't get it. I don't know. I don't think there is. Then we provide like a little clue or a little...
The clue.
Yeah, the clue. So that, and then it just keeps them going. And like I've told you this before, like we have spent, this is supposed to be a minds-on activity, but it has lasted us like over a 40-minute period.
Because you read your room and you read the engagement. You're like, it doesn't matter if it's only scheduled for 10 minutes. Look at the thinking that's going on.
Exactly. So it works out really well. I find that working with the non-curricular tasks to be very powerful to start the year because students feel successful. And that's a feeling that they typically don't have in math. It's either I'm really great at it or I am horrible at it. And they they resort to that narrative really fast in math, which is so sad and so unfortunate. Starting with those non-curricular tasks, it really gets them to feel successful. They are engaged, they're having fun, they're enjoying it, and they feel like a little bit of success because they really, really get into the problem that they're trying to solve. And so I think that really makes a big difference, that engagement level. And I think that as we get into the curricular tasks, we want to find high engagement level tasks, like those really high resolution tasks that are very rich, that allow them to immerse themselves and see themselves as experiencing this problem. And that is typically when we see the best output when it comes to math tasks.
When Peter demonstrated it for us, he has certainly layers of tasks, and it's sort of a similar theme. He wants to build successes, but also not have a definitive ending, so that maybe a student that's feeling, and not only feeling confident, but is having success, doesn't just all of a sudden finish a task in 14 seconds and say, what do I do next?
Yeah.
And I must admit that even when I used it last year, I did use sort of one-off activities, even if they were challenging, and I would use clues. I didn't have just a scaffolding of we move to event, or next to, and certainly in the PDs he did, he always, here's your question, but then, revisit back here, and there's a follow-up question, the follow-up question, and the follow-up question. And I have never used thinking classrooms to that extent, not when I was in the coaching. And in LA, my tasks are very much minds-on related. So when I was thinking about how am I going to create LA tasks, there are some that are available, but predominantly I wanted it to use it to some of my science of reading concepts and my Freire model concepts. So one day I would give random letters, make as many words as you can. Then it's make as many words with the EA together. Make as many words with X amount of syllables. So I would then curate into that content, and the students really remain very engaged. And I'll only use it for 10 or 15 minutes. There's not necessarily a follow-up.
Right.
Sometimes I'll say some criteria just so we can wrap up and have a few talking points. But in terms of LA tasks, these have been really great warm-up tasks, or simply, here's the Freire model. Here's a 3 choice of 3 topics we've been doing in history in your group. Design the Freire model up on your thinking classroom. And so those have been very successful. The building of words, taking a particular word. If we're using Remembrance Day that I ranted on earlier, here's Remembrance Day. How many words can you build out of that? Let them work for a little bit, and then say, how many words can you build with this? How many words can you build with that? That has worked really well, and more than really well, fantastically well.
Right.
So that when I start the class and I say, well, this is our thinking class activity for the day, there's no hesitation to get up to the board. It becomes part of that class culture.
Right. I would say that sounds like a lot of success. And I think it works really well as the kind of like mini lessons, like you're doing a little consolidation for mini lessons and things like that. And that's, we'll talk about this probably a little bit later, but when I'm teaching those specific skills, it's called thin slicing in building thinking classrooms. And we'll talk about that a little later. But I'm finding, as I'm getting a little bit more into it, we're into curricular tasks now. And so we're into the units. I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing transference of those skills to now when we are doing work independently in our own seats. Because yes, we are talking about groups of 3, which we're going to talk about next. And I think that there's still this little bit of dependence that is happening on the other 2 people that are in your group. And then when we sit down, I don't know if it's lack of confidence. I don't know if it's this inability to make a connection to what we're actually doing in the classroom. Maybe I need to change up what that lesson looks like in order to make that transference happen. But something that we talked about in our PLC, which I think is very relevant, that there's a certain amount of unlearning that needs to happen in the classroom space, especially when it comes to how math is taught and how math is learned, for students to really find a level of success with this program. And I think that where I'm stuck right now is that unlearning, that students have this expectation of what math should look like because they have gone through this for 5 or 6 or 7 years in school already. And now all of a sudden we're flipping things on its head, and they don't really know what to do with that. And so I think that that's what I'm seeing, and that's what I'm struggling with right now with the types of tasks and how I'm able to make it relevant to, I'm going to say the biggest swear word in education right now, and it's standardized testing. And it is a standardized testing year, EQAO year in grade 6. How do I reconcile all of this rich math learning that's happening with this week-long test that's going to happen at the end of May and the early June, and make it feel like students are successful when they are doing that?
Because these are the real realities of classroom teachers, that they have these pressures and these accountabilities on them when our system doesn't change. We have this conversation. How's come our report card marks don't match our standardized tests? Really?
Yeah.
Like, you don't get this? Of course they don't match, because we're being... it's not even being pressured. We're giving all this liberation to diversify how we're marking, how we're honoring knowledge, and then we funnel it all back in a very standardized assessment, and then question why they don't match. They're not going to match. That's the point, isn't it? Isn't that the point we're trying to see?
Yeah.
Is that because if they matched, then you wouldn't need to do it.
Right.
On one level.
I don't know. When is that standardized testing going to catch up then with what we're expected to do in the classroom?
Well, because this is where, on a more philosophical level, we preach dismantling the system with no real thought of dismantling the system at all. And who's in the position and who has the positionality to put pressure on people for this false narrative that it wants to be disrupted when they have no business or desire to want it disrupted? All they want to be able to do is tell people to disrupt it so they can position themselves as a disruptor while doing no disruption. Pav, I've got an interlude waiting on the manipulation and education on this topic at all. There is no desire to change.
I think it goes beyond education. I think it funnels into every institution that exists out there. I think that's just the nature of the beast. That's how people keep their jobs.
I only know two institutions, MLB and education.
We already know that.
Pav, but I do like the fact you brought, as teachers, we're struggling, or how do we take that the rich learning going here and we bring it off into different spaces? We don't necessarily see that the skills that we're seeing displayed in those spaces showing up in there.
Yeah.
When we get to a workbook or a quiz or an independent task or a word problem, that where you're not necessarily standing in the vertical space working with the group, it's not transferring. And if you're thinking you're working in that group of 3, you're hoping maybe one kid has the marker and 2 people are thinking in that particular dynamic, but you're hoping that everyone's learning equally, whatever you want to define the word equally as. But when you bring them back to a different task, a void of that environment, it's not transferring.
Yeah, it's not transferring. Yeah. And that's where I'm struggling right now. That's what I am not seeing happening. And so maybe I haven't engaged enough with all of the different parts of this book. Maybe I haven't engaged with the note-taking portion. Maybe I haven't done, and these are some of the next steps that I have. Like, I want to introduce all of these things, but I'm really, really aching to see a student say to me, or even just to be able to visually see that the work that they're doing in these vertical spaces is transferring to another task that doesn't involve that space. Like, are you able to independently show me that you have learned what we're trying to learn from that thinking space? But maybe it could just be that I'm not approaching this in the correct way. And maybe that's something that I need to learn as the facilitator of this math class.
We're not coming to this conversation as we got it right. We're not coming to this conversation as we mastered. We're coming to this conversation as this is what it looks like in a middle school experience. Like, we are giving, this is the documentation everyone wants.
Right.
Well, they probably don't realize they want it, as in comment to reference before. This is how a teacher struggles through it. And we're having this open dialogue to try to find better ways of embedding it in a system that we both really enjoy and we both see great growth, but we haven't necessarily been able to implement it totally with here's a real
triangulate it. Yeah.
Well, even this as a snapshot of education, both really committed to it. We still haven't been able to completely immerse it. And maybe this teacher voice is the voice you need to hear before you get gaslight into pressure. And why didn't you just do it all at once? It's not just that easy to do it all at once.
It's not.
You got to work through it, and you got to have colleagues you can conversate with. And this is the dialogue right here. So that's our little rant on.
And can I add, you have to provide the reasoning to the students too. You can't just introduce something brand new to students and be like, all right, just pick it up as we go. Like, you have to explain the logic behind thinking classrooms to students as you go. And I think that that's really, really helpful to the journey. That's helpful for you as a teacher to really clearly understand why you're doing it. And I think that it's important for the students to see why you're doing it as well. And so we've talked about, as we get into randomized groups, we've talked about why it's important to have groups of 3. We've talked about why it's important to randomize those groups and why it's important to, okay, have your 30 seconds of, oh, I really wanted to work with my friend, but then just get to your group and start. And so we've talked about that and we've had that conversation at the very beginning. And I think that it was a very important conversation. I don't think we could have started this Thinking Classrooms task or this type of learning in action without having these conversations as we go. You were laughing?
Oh, when you were talking about, have to be with your friends, because it reminds me of a tongue-in-cheek joke I had with your grade 8s. It said they won't be your friends in grade 9.
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
Tongue-in-cheek with my class.
Grade 6s to grade 7s, they will be.
That's right. Like my friends. They won't even be your friends in 4 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, that part is true.
So that's just a little analysis on task. Pav, you wanted to jump into groups?
Yeah, let's talk about that. I thought it was going to be harder to convince students to work with random kids from the class. Maybe it's because we are in a K to 8 school and many of these kids have grown up with each other since kindergarten. So they know each other extremely well, almost like siblings. And so it was a lot less difficult than I thought it was going to be. I thought I was going to hear a lot of whining and complaining. And I attribute the success a little bit to the fact that they know each other really, really well already. And a little bit to the fact that we really talked about the importance of why we are putting ourselves into these randomized groups, why they are groups of 3, and how we are supposed to be working when we are in these groups. Like Chey, you alluded to this little fact already, that the students are going to be working in groups of 3, and they are going to be working with students that they don't know, or students that they don't typically want to work with, but they're doing this for a reason, that they don't get to just depend on their friends to do all of the work. And then also the person that is holding the marker is not the one that's doing the talking and the thinking. So the students that are kind of talking about their strategy, they hand the marker over to one of their peers at the group and they say, and they talk through the strategy that they want to implement, and then somebody else does the writing. That way you're transferring your knowledge by talking about what's happening. You're actually talking about the math with your peers. And so I think that strategy has worked really well. They do the initial, like I use Flippity. It's a online it's a website that does the randomized grouping, and it works out really well. It's called flippity.net. And then you choose like the randomized grouper, and it works really well. I created a Excel, like a Google sheet one time, and then I just click on the link and it automatically randomizes, and they actually look forward to it. So I give them, I pick a person in the classroom and I say, pick a number between 30 and 40, and they pick 33, and so we actually go through and hit the randomize button 33 times, and then that they can see that it's actually random. Like they know at this point that I'm not putting them with anybody intentionally. What you see is what you get, and it works well. They do the initial oh man, but then they go and they get started and they do it. They don't complain, which I was actually very surprised about.
I'd be surprised too if you didn't complain to me.
You missed that whole conversation.
Not at all.
No.
The group, because you know what? We're gonna do a commercial. We'll come back because I have done something different with groups. Mm-hmm. But you've had great success sticking to the formula, right, and having the app Flippity. And in the classroom I used last year, they just use popsicle sticks. Yeah. Really efficient. And yes, I agree. From what I've seen as a coach and in your room, this isn't the obstacle we think it's going to be.
Right. Yeah. I was surprised, and it wasn't an obstacle at all.
And you're listening to the Chey and Pav Show. Lots of conversation and lots of action. And we'll be right back after this commercial break.
Get your hands up to
And you're listening to the Chey and Pav Show. The Chey and Pav Show is sponsored by whiteboard markers, because if you're involved in the thinking classroom, you will need 16,423 by the end of first term, or you just won't have enough.
You know, a problem with that?
It's a
just gonna say-
commercial.
I know it's a commercial, but here's a problem. They take the finished ones and they toss them into the same bin as the fresh ones. So I've got a whole mishmash now. I don't even know what works and what doesn't.
And this episode is also brought to you by Marker Tops, because in my classroom, I have 743 whiteboard markers with no lids, and this is our new business. And you're listening to the Chey and Pav Show, and we'll be right back.
Get your hands up to the floor.
And you're listening to the Chey and Pav Show. And we are back. In all my time, I've never had a commercial interrupted. Those are our paid sponsors.
They pay well. They won't mind.
Pav, you talked about groups, and
Yeah.
I'm going to share my example with groups because it came up in our PLC about how the randomized group's going. And I haven't been using randomized groups. I haven't even been using groups of 3. So in my rooms, and group contracts, I was open to the idea right from the get-go, right? Build some community norms, sit where you want to sit in our groups. What do you think is responsible expectations for sitting in the groups that you select? And so I've got groups of 2, groups of 4, groups of 6. I've got some big groups, but we've talked it through. And so in my classroom space, I aligned a whiteboard space to go with every group.
Okay.
And so I've got
Physically.
Physically.
Okay.
So it's just an easy transition. It's desk here. And so I've used, and again, I'm teaching LA and history, so it's a little bit different. And I've been using some of these sort of minds-on activities, the building of words, the consonant sounds, the syllable connections, a variety of things related to that. I used the Freire model in regards to history, stuff like that. So you could argue maybe not tasks that are ascending, but they're highly effective. And when it came to the group work, it became part of that group task or the group dynamic that they had sort of established. So when they come in, I'm going to have a group task. And so I wasn't necessarily saying I'm not using groups of 3, but I said, I have a board connected with my group. I do have a few extra boards, so I could divide up by 3s if I had to, but I said, let me start some tasks connected simply with the table and see how they go. When I implemented it first for the LA space, I was thinking this would be a 10-minute activity. But similar to you, the kids were engaged in the task. They wanted to look around. They wanted to excel. They wanted to look at what other groups were doing. Now, it came a little bit more competition-based, which isn't necessarily an intended consequence, but I guess the style of the task was one number they fixed it is how many words can I make?
Yes.
How many, like for me, it's not as important how many words you can make, but for them, when it's like build words, it's like, I got 98. We got 98. Look over there. They got 96. They got 96. We're beating them, Mr. Cheney.
That's natural.
Right. So they're keen on that. But one thing I notice is the groups are 2s or 4s, like I said, 6s. But one, no one's ever been unengaged. So the desire to say, I know the data suggests 3 is the premium number. But I've got 2 groups of 6, and most of my groups are 4, and a few smaller groups. But I do have 2 massive groups of 6, but they're engaged. And yes, even with one singular marker, they're still all up there sharing ideas. And so as I was sharing with my group, I would change it and modify it if I didn't see in front of me that it wasn't working.
Right.
But the groups of 6 are working just as well as the groups of 4. They're working just as well as the groups of 2. And the group of 2 doesn't look over at the group of 6 and say they have more people.
Right.
They're engaged in the
task.
In the task.
Right.
And so I said to myself, if I needed to, I would. But at the moment, I don't. I'm getting the output and the engagement and the enthusiasm.
Right.
Now, again, I could preface, I'm not doing necessarily math tasks. I'm not teaching math. And they're not necessarily tasks that are sending. They're more minds-on warm-up style activities. But the class culture has really been embedded in that. And it's worked really well.
Now, can I interrupt with a question?
Yeah.
Do you think that everybody in that group of 4 or 5 or 6 is equally engaged?
I don't know how you could. I don't know how you could really qualify engagement, and I don't know how you really could qualify engagement in 3 either. Like what is engagement?
So, like if you're observing talking,
Yes,
with everybody.
like if that's the engagement level, then yes, they're
Okay,
engaged.
sure.
Now, but what is engagement? Learning? Well, yeah, we can
Well,
make
no,
that.
I'm not saying are they learning.
I
I'm
don't.
saying
When
are
I
they
got groups of 6,
engaged?
they are all around
They're
the board. They're all on the
engaged.
board. It's not
Okay.
like 2 sit on the desk. You 4 got this time, eh? So, like I said, if I saw that it wasn't working, I would change.
Right.
And I gave the analogy when we were giving this debrief with our staff. I said, it's like gas. It's $1.46. That's a great deal, but it takes me 35 minutes to go get it. It's $1.48 just down the street, and it takes me 30 seconds to go get. So yes, I appreciate that the $1.46 is a better value, but how many obstacles am I going through to get the $1.46 when $1.48 is still a good deal, and it works really well, and I spend no time in my car? I gotta take the $1.48. And so I use this analogy. I agree, or I don't necessarily agree. It's not for me to agree or disagree. I will assume that the data that 3 is the optimal number is correct, but I don't necessarily know how unoptimal it is to have 4 or
Right.
5 or
Right.
6. Is it 30 degrees?
So Peter does talk about that in the book. He does provide data that they have tried different numbers, and this is, I guess, statistically, analytically, this is the best that they saw out of all of the groupings. And I believe that.
So do I.
Yeah. And so we're not negating that. But does that work for every single situation and every single scenario? No, I don't think that we can possibly say that. So I think, again, it comes back to we are all professionals. We have to use our professional judgment in figuring out what is going to work best for our contextual situation and our scenario.
I would never tell people don't use 3, but I would also suggest you don't. If that becomes an obstacle of
Right.
access, then break away.
Exactly.
Try something different.
Exactly.
It was easy in the setup of my room to connect a white book to a table, to a group. And now it's just
Right.
it's step up right there, step up right there, step up right there.
And I'll provide another scenario that kind of highlights the same thing. If you've got a couple of students absent, you end up with 4 left over at the end, you have to look at those 4 students and say, are these 4 students going to work better together, or do they work better when I split them up into 2 pairs? So you have to kind of look at what you have going on in the room. Now, if there are 4 students that you could probably get great output from when they are working together as a group of 4, rather than if you were to split them up into 2 groups of 2, then you want to go with what is going to be best. And maybe you have to try both in order to be able to figure that out. But I think that it requires that little bit of judgment that we're there to facilitate. So
In my group dynamics, I could tell you some of those groups of 4 work better in the thinking classroom model than they work in their groups of 4.
yeah, I 100% believe that. I totally believe that.
So even beyond the 3, as a means of working as a group, it's a great way to work collaboratively.
Yes, I think hands down we can say that.
Yes. So there's my little spiel on not even spiel. That's sort of where I'm working through with groups in my thinking classroom.
And I don't think I have anything else to add there. I know that section 3 is talking about the non-permanent vertical spaces. I think that we've talked a lot about this already. And the only thing that I would say is that it was a lot easier for me to rotate between group to group to group than if they were all working on desk surfaces. I found it easier to just take a peek to see who is where and who needs me to come over and take a look, and where kind of some of all of the action is and what I'm seeing on the boards. I have a very big classroom. My classroom space is probably like, I don't know, maybe not 2 full classroom sizes, but close to 2 full classroom size. And it's sometimes hard for me to see what's happening on a white book on the other side of the room, but I can sort of, it's easy to gauge when the math is happening in a vertical space. So that is upright. Everyone is standing rather than writing on a table. And I can see all of the work that is happening. And it was a lot easier for me to circulate the room than I anticipated. I thought I was going to be just all over the place, like zooming from here to here to here to here. And I am still zipping around quite a bit, but it is pretty easy to monitor what's happening in the classroom space when everybody is standing in their own little section.
Because you're centered.
I am
little play.
So I am
this
physically.
is physically centered.
Yeah, I am physically centered. Yes.
You are able to see the work. The work is
Right.
really out there. It's easy. Then it's almost the physicality makes it easy to deliver feedback.
Right.
Because it's not like when students are writing on their desk, I always feel that that's their private space. As a teacher, I don't feel I can just come right over your shoulder and tell you what I
Yes.
see. But when you're working upright, I feel very comfortable. I think the class is there's an expectation is that this is shared learning. The idea of looking over at other boards. So there's.
But I will also say, but I am not centered in terms of the math that is happening. So I am physically centered.
I was just tongue in cheeking because this
I
idea.
just wanted to clarify that because I am not in that situation centered. Like they couldn't care. They wouldn't even know if I was in the room.
We had this conversation in the hallway. As much as they're engaged to the task and they're on their board. When you're thinking about why there's no distractions, because even old school, when you're putting the kids up against the wall and they're looking towards the wall, they're less likely to notice what the person it's a bad viewing angle.
Right.
Even something as simple as that.
They're facing the wall.
That's right.
That was the punishment when
I
was
had
a
to do
kid.
that 20 years ago. It wasn't because I was thinking. or
right.
because I was distinctly not thinking. But we talked a little bit. There's there's a little bit of simplistic physicality to pacing on the room, and especially if you have a little bit of space, you create some space where a lot of that fear of students not focusing or students going around, it's not there because the dynamics of the setup don't really incline people. Like when people start to talk out loud or not pay attention, you know what the number one indicator of that is? Eye contact. If I got eye contact, students are going to drift.
Yeah.
Because that eye contact is a social cue to talk.
Right.
And so when you put them in the corner of the room, tongue in cheek, Peter is cringing right now. He's probably looking at my teacher.
They are just destroying
He's
this
like,
whole
I'm never
thing.
putting this on my website. But when you put students in those spaces, there's a certain physicality that actually alleviates some of those things that as a teacher you're worried about.
Yeah.
And then it's simply reinforced and enhanced by the fact that the tasks are engaging.
Yeah.
But for that brief moment, just the position of all these spaces actually don't incline to students going off to doing whatever they want.
Right. Yes, I agree. I don't know. Do we have time to get into the next one? The space?
You know what? When you talk about not centering the room, I think it's. I had a conversation with another conversation talked about, and they said they didn't move their desks because you know what? Like it's about positions of desks and that type of thing. And she commented, when they're all up at their boards, it doesn't matter what way their desks are facing.
Right.
Because they're all at their boards.
They're all at the boards. That's right.
So, fair.
Yeah.
I don't have rows per se, but the centering, I think, Pav, you and I had this conversation. It's the oversimplification of the concept of centering when we simply fixate on the design of the room. Because you know what? I can have the most creative desk alignment I want, but if I sit and talk all the time, I'm centered.
Right.
And I'm still centering myself. Now, Pav, I've had the opposite conversation. Sometimes the teacher needs to be centered.
Yes.
And I don't say this because of my 22 years and my ego. I say this because my 22 years of teaching really reaches out to student voice, and I know a lot of our pedagogies, and I know a lot of our progressive logic tells us certain things, and there's a false sense of what the answers are going to be. You can read between the lines if you want or not, because I'm writing on the lines. But when I ask my students, what is it they want from me as a teacher? What does they need from me as a teacher? I know what everyone wants them to say, but I'll tell you what comes out almost assuredly is teacher is knowledgeable on the content. Teacher can control the room. I can rely on the teacher. Students, and now someone's going to tell me, oh, that's because they've been conditioned to be that. But you know why my children are my dependents? Because they depend on me. Mm-hmm. As a society, we've actually already decided that our youth are dependent on the adults. This is why you can't buy cigarettes at 12.
Right.
Like we forget that the cognitive data is already there. We already have a society to agree on a certain level that our students need a little bit of guidance.
Right.
And when I try to remove my guidance, which I do as much as I can, I always keep in mind that my students, their ability to be liberated is when they know on a certain level, the teacher on an academic level or on a discipline level, it's stretched the definition to making sure the room is safe. They can rely on the teacher. So the teacher is like the flip of the coin, has to be able to center themselves at the snap of a finger when needed.
Right.
Depending on whatever the issue is. That being said, to decenter the room isn't so much about, I would argue, about the placement of everything, because you become the center wherever you are. It's about, when you talked about those tasks, when I come over to your group, do I center myself in the answer? How do I remove myself from you working through it? The productive struggle. How much of am I needed for you to work through the productive struggle?
Right.
And the more I'm needed, the more I'm centered.
Yes. And I think that to add to that, I don't have much to add to that because I think I 100%, not I think, I do 100% agree with you. I think the only thing that I need to add to that is that students have gotten used to the fact that when I come around, when I circulate, unless you have asked me to come to the board, if I'm circulating, I'm at the board, I'm only there to take pictures. I'm not there for any other reason.
Selfies?
Yeah, sometimes a selfie, but usually just to let me take a picture of you while you are working because I'm interested to see where you are in your thinking process. And they like to show that off. So they continue working. They don't see me and they think to themselves, oh, we need to ask. She's only here because we probably did something wrong and we need to explain ourselves, or we need to ask her a question. They know I'm just there to take a picture because they're quite engaged, unless they call me over. And in that case, it's like, are we on the right track? And then, we can get to that part of the book a little bit later because we likely will not. It's that hour and 10 into this episode already. So we probably want to wrap things up soon.
No, it's not, because people are listening at 1.25 speed. So it's only been 40 minutes.
All right. You probably sound like a mouse.
Well, that's a Star Trek episode when the two, I believe Captain Kirk and Spock, are on a different time continuum.
Ooh.
And literally they hear Dr. McCoy as he speaks, but when they speak, Dr. McCoy thinks it's a fly because they're moving at a much faster pace.
Interesting. I like that. I watched a movie last night that I thought was a horribly made movie, but the concept was really cool.
Blade Runner?
No, there's a place on Earth. Oh my gosh, I don't even know what it was called. But it was a M. Night Shyamalan movie, a newer one, older. And what happens is there's a place on Earth, there's a beach that time moves a lot faster than the rest of the world. And so, and you see this aging happening in triple speed.
That's another Star Trek episode too.
Is it?
Where I want to say a disease. Disease is too negative a word, and they start to age rapidly.
Oh,
And Captain
this
Kirk's-
is very similar to the movie.
They stole it from Captain Kirk.
Well, it probably did. But I'm not going to give away the ending, but it's a little bit different than what you're describing.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was the concept was great. I didn't enjoy the acting.
Pav, can we come back to room design? I think the key is that as much as I'm sort of not saying don't worry about as much about the furniture for other philosophical factors. One, you do need to set up don't need to. It's not for me to tell you what to do. We have both been very confident in making very definitive thinking classroom spaces. We have our thinking board. You have a little space to put in sheets or information beside it. You and I have put QR codes beside it that links to the Edutopia article. Maybe one day it'll link to ours, to the Edutopia article on thinking classrooms. Then we have a document on sort of productive struggle. So there's some scaffolding right around the board. So as a class culture, you see that we value the thinking classroom spaces.
Yes.
And now, not every teacher's gifted with that, with the walls of the
Right.
space. Now, I do have a small room, so I can contest a little bit. I've given up chalkboards to do it.
Right.
I've given up valuable wall space to do it, where I would hang work. But there's still a little bit of room to hang work, and I still have, I believe I have 7 stations with enough space in between them that I can accommodate for 6 people in a group.
Yes.
And I think it becomes part of that room setup when I know that it's like on a bigger, students know what teachers value, and this shows that you value that space. So if you're able to commit to the whiteboard spaces, now, again, not to gaslight, maybe my inappropriate use of gaslight. Some teachers don't have that ability. You have to use the windows, etc. But we have found great success, I think, with really having clearly definitive space for the thinking classroom.
Yes. It sets it up as something that we are going to, it's an intentional space. We are going to be doing this, and we're going to be using those spaces, not just for math, thinking classrooms just in math, but thinking in general in a multitude of curricular areas. So the intentionality of that space, again, it goes back to talking to students about the logic behind it and the reasoning behind it. It gives us an opportunity to tell them that this is why we are doing it. And so not that they need to buy in, but it gives them that information if they are curious and wondering.
Should we wrap this up?
I think we should.
There's only 6 people still listening. That's not true, actually. That's not true. I've seen the data. I know how many people listen. I just don't know their ages.
Yes.
I'd say there's a swag bag, but I don't know if we really have a swag
Yeah,
bag.
we don't really need. We talked about. Sorry, I'll let you do the swag bag like normal.
I was going to say, what is this? This is an artifact. This is 2 middle school teachers committed to Thinking Classrooms, liking how Thinking Classroom is impacting the learning in their room through math and science and language and history. We're still working through it. It isn't I can just fully adapt this in 3 weeks. We're not superstar teachers, because I assume there's 4 teachers that'll say, I did it in 5 minutes. But predominantly, most of us need to work through it like this. And we hope that this conversation isn't the end. It's not the pinnacle. This is certainly not the pinnacle of the Thinking Classroom.
No, not at all.
But this is an artifact of how teachers work through implementation of the Thinking Classroom. And we only really talked about the first 4 elements. There's so many more elements. So this sets us up perfectly for 2032, part 2 of the Thinking Classroom episode.
Yes.
But Pav, we just thank you for diving into the conversation. Pav, I feel really confident talking in the mic. I said this last episode, as a teacher. I feel back in my element, and I've loved this conversation, which is why, for me, I haven't noticed an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah. Well, there was also 7 minutes where you were going to the bathroom, so
Edit
I'll have to edit that out.
What we talked about today, we talked about the tasks. We talked about enriching those tasks, how we pick our tasks, the non-curricular, the curricular. I talked about using basic minds-on activities. We talked about our grouping. Pav and I have 2 very distinct uses of the grouping.
Yes.
Pav has adhered to it strictly. I, in my usual revolutionary fashion, have not. But both of us have seen successes. We talked about the space, the vertical spaces, the creation of those spaces, honoring those spaces, making part of your class culture. And we talked a little bit about how we center ourselves. And you and I pushed on the idea of don't fixate on low resolution understandings of what is centered. And got a little philosophical talking about the need to sometimes be centered. And you've been listening to the Chey and Pav Show.
Great wrap up.
Teachers talking.
Teaching. Thank you for joining us, everybody, for episode 131, Building Thinking Classrooms, part 1.
And we'll see you on the podium of the Canadian Podcast Awards.
Yay.
Fingers crossed. Maybe. Thank you, everyone. Been a great conversation. Thank you for gifting us your time.
Chey is in the bathroom, I'm by myself. Chey is in the bathroom, I'm by myself. I don't think he can hear me. I am by myself.